I'm Eleanor Thompson, 34 years old, and I've spent my life building glass towers in Boston that are stronger than the walls my father put between us. When the hospital called about his cancer, 21 years of silence suddenly felt too loud. Dad once paid for the education that made my career, but the price was never coming home again. Now he's dying and asking for forgiveness. Some promises weren't meant to be broken, but some doors weren't meant to stay closed forever either. Before I tell you about the call that changed everything, let me know where you're watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you've ever had to make peace with a painful past. Trust me, what happens next will make you question everything about forgiveness. Growing up in Lakeside, Connecticut, we were the family everyone envied from the outside. My father, Samuel Thompson, was the success story of our small town, having built his financial consulting firm from scratch. Our colonial-style house, with its perfect white picket fence, stood proudly on Maple Street, seeming to embody the American dream that my father so fiercely protected. Mum was different from Dad. Diane Thompson had a gentle way about her with soft hands that would brush my hair every night before bed while humming quietly. She loved us unconditionally, but there was always a sadness behind her smile, especially when Dad was in one of his moods. She had given up her career as a music teacher to support his becoming the perfect corporate wife who hosted dinner parties and attended charity galas on his arm. In those early years, I actually thought Dad and I had something special. When I was very young, maybe 5 or 6, he would sometimes let me sit in his home office while he worked. I'd draw quietly at the small table he'd set up for me, and occasionally he'd look over and nod with approval. Those small moments of connection meant everything to me. "You've got a good eye for detail, Eleanor," he said once, examining a house I had drawn with painstaking care. "That might serve you well in business someday." But business was never my passion. By the time I was 8, my artistic abilities had become more evident. My elementary school art teacher had called my parents in for a conference, specifically to discuss my talent. I remember the pride I felt when Mrs. Wilson showed them my portfolio, explaining that I had a unique spatial intelligence that was quite advanced for my age. Mum beamed and hugged me tight afterward. Dad simply nodded and said, "That's nice, but let's not get carried away. Art is a hobby, not a career path." That was the first time I remember feeling the distance between us widen, like watching someone walk away on a long road. It would only get longer as the years passed. Jack came along when I was 9, a surprise addition to our family that changed the dynamic completely. From the moment my brother was born, it was clear that Dad saw in him what he had hoped to see in me, a legacy, a continuation, someone to mold in his image. "Now I have someone to take over the business," he'd say, bouncing baby Jack on his knee. It didn't matter that Jack was just an infant with no discernible business acumen. In Dad's mind, the future was already written. As Jack grew into a toddler and then a young boy, the contrast in how Dad treated us became impossible to ignore. Where I received criticism, Jack received praise. Where I was expected to be perfect, Jack was allowed to make mistakes. Where I was given conditions for love, Jack received it freely. "Why can't you be more focused like your brother?" Dad would ask when my mind wandered during his impromptu business lessons at the dinner table. It didn't seem to matter that Jack was 7 years younger and had a very different personality. In Dad's eyes, Jack's natural interest in Dad's work made him superior even as a child. Mum tried to balance things out when she could, giving me extra attention and encouraging my artistic pursuits. She would take me to museums on weekends when Dad was working, showing me the works of great architects and artists. "You see how buildings can be art too, Eleanor," she would say, pointing out the sweeping lines of a museum's dramatic entrance. "The people who designed these spent years learning how to make something both beautiful and functional." Those were the happiest days of my childhood, standing next to Mom as she helped me understand that my way of seeing the world had value. But even those days were numbered. Mum's cancer diagnosis came without warning when I was 11. Pancreatic advanced with a prognosis that left little room for hope. Within a year, she was gone, leaving a gaping hole in our family that Dad had no idea how to fill. The night after Mum's funeral, I found Dad in his office, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at nothing. When I approached, he looked at me with eyes that didn't seem to recognize me at first. "You look like her," he said finally, his voice hollow. It wasn't a compliment or an accusation, just a statement of fact that seemed to cause him pain. After Mum died, Dad retreated further into his work, leaving Jack and me to essentially raise ourselves with the help of a series of nannies who never stayed long. His drinking, which had been occasional before, became a nightly ritual. By the time dinner was served at 7, he'd already have had 2 or 3 glasses of whiskey, making him unpredictable and often cruel in his comments. I started acting out in school, my grades slipping as I struggled with grief and the increasingly tense home environment. My teachers sent notes home, but Dad either didn't read them or didn't care enough to address the issue directly. Instead, he added my academic performance to his growing list of disappointments. Jack, only 4 when Mum died, attached himself to me in her absence. I became his protector, the one who checked his homework, made sure he brushed his teeth and comforted him when he had nightmares. Dad noticed this too, and it seemed to irritate him, as though I was usurping a role that should have been his, even though he had abandoned it willingly. By the time I turned 13, our house had become a battlefield with Dad and me as opposing generals, and poor Jack caught in the crossfire. I couldn't understand then that Dad was drowning in his own grief and failure, lashing out at the easiest target, the daughter who reminded him too much of the wife he couldn't save. All I knew was that nothing I did was ever good enough, and the father I had once desperately wanted to please now seemed to find my very existence an affront. What I didn't realize was that Dad was formulating a solution to our mutual problem, one that would change the course of my life forever. The summer I turned 13 was unusually hot in Connecticut. The air conditioning in our house kept breaking down, making the atmosphere even more stifling than the emotional tension already did. I had taken to spending as much time as possible at the public library, where it was cool and quiet, and where the librarians didn't mind if I spent hours reading art and architecture books that transported me far away from Lakeside. It was on one of those sweltering July evenings that everything finally broke open. I had come home to find Jack hiding in his room, refusing to come out even for dinner. When I finally coaxed the door open, I found him curled up on his bed, face streaked with tears. "What happened, buddy?" I asked, sitting next to him and brushing his hair out of his eyes. "Dad said I'm stupid," he whispered, his 6-year-old voice cracking. "I knocked over his papers by accident, and he said I'm careless and stupid and will never amount to anything." Something snapped inside me. I had endured Dad's criticism and emotional neglect for years, but seeing him direct that same venom at Jack, who was just a little kid, ignited a protective fury I couldn't contain. I marched downstairs to find Dad in the dining room, already on his second drink, as Martina, our newest nanny, silently set the table for dinner. "You had no right to talk to Jack that way," I said, hands trembling with anger. "He's 6 years old." Dad looked up from his financial papers, his expression shifting from surprise to cold anger. "This doesn't concern you, Eleanor. Go get your brother for dinner." "No," I said, standing my ground. "Not until you apologize to him." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Martina discreetly slipped into the kitchen, clearly wanting no part of the confrontation. "What did you just say to me?" Dad's voice was dangerously quiet. "I said no. You're hurting him just like you've been hurting me. Mum would be ashamed of how you're treating us." The mention of Mum was a step too far. Dad's face flushed dark red, and he slammed his glass down so hard that whiskey sloshed onto the polished table. "Don't you dare talk about what your mother would think," he hissed. "You think you know everything at 13. You think raising 2 kids alone while running a business is easy. You have no idea what real life is like, Eleanor. No idea at all." I stood there shaking but refusing to back down. "Then maybe you should show us instead of just criticizing and ignoring us." Dad stared at me for a long moment. Then something shifted in his eyes. The anger didn't disappear, but it was replaced by something colder and more calculated. "Fine," he said finally. "Sit down. We're going to have a talk about your future." Wearily, I took a seat across from him, my heart pounding. "I've been looking into boarding schools," he said, his voice eerily calm now. "Ashfield Academy in Massachusetts has an excellent reputation. Their art program is nationally recognized." I stared at him in confusion, not understanding the sudden shift in conversation. "I'm willing to pay for you to attend Ashfield," he continued. "Full tuition room and board, art supplies, everything. You could start this fall." For a brief moment, hope flickered inside me. Was this his way of supporting my interests after all? Had he finally seen me? "But there's one condition," he added, and the flicker died as quickly as it had ignited. "If you go, you don't come back. Not for holidays, not for summers. You make your life there and I'll provide the financial support until you graduate college, but this arrangement would be permanent." The words hit me like physical blows. My father was offering to send me away, permanently, to erase me from his life while maintaining the appearance of parental responsibility. You're sending me away." My voice sounded small even to my own ears. "I'm offering you an opportunity," he corrected, his tone businesslike. A prestigious education that will set you up for success. But this household clearly isn't big enough for both of us, and Jack needs stability. This is the best solution for everyone. What about Jack? I asked, thinking of my little brother upstairs. Who will look after him? I'll hire a better nanny, Dad said dismissively. Someone more qualified than you. He's my son. I'll make sure he's taken care of. The same son he'd just called stupid, I thought, but didn't say. You have 1 week to decide, Dad concluded, rising from the table as though we'd just discussed something as mundane as a change in the dinner menu. Think carefully about what kind of future you want, Eleanor. He left me sitting there, my dinner untouched, as the full weight of his ultimatum settled over me. My own father was offering to pay me to disappear from his life. The following day, I called my Aunt Maggie, Mum's sister, who lived in Rhode Island. Aunt Maggie had always been kind to me, sending birthday cards with encouraging notes about my artwork, and calling occasionally to check in after Mum died, though Dad didn't particularly welcome her involvement. He said what? She gasped when I explained the situation over the phone. Oh, Eleanor, I'm so sorry. Your father... He's not been the same since Diane died, but this is beyond the pale. What should I do, Aunt Maggie? I asked, fighting back tears. I don't want to leave Jack, but I hate it here. Dad doesn't want me anyway. There was a long pause before she answered. Honey, I wish I could offer you another option. If I was in a position to take you in, I would in a heartbeat. But with the divorce and having to move to this tiny apartment, her voice trailed off regretfully. It's okay, I assured her, though it wasn't. Look, Eleanor, she said finally. Ashfield is one of the best schools in the country. The opportunities you'd have there, the doors it would open for you. Maybe this is a terrible situation with a silver lining. You could get an education that would let you become independent from your father sooner rather than later. But Jack... I'll keep a closer eye on Jack, she promised. I'll visit more often and make sure he's okay. Maybe this way you can build a life that would eventually let you help Jack too when he's older. Her words made a certain kind of sense even through the hurt. Maybe this was my chance to break free, to build something for myself beyond the constant criticism and disappointment that defined my relationship with Dad. The week passed in a fog of indecision and dread. I spent extra time with Jack, trying to explain in terms a 6-year-old could understand that I might be going away to school, but that I would still love him and think about him every day. He cried and clung to me, not fully comprehending why his sister had to leave. On the 7th day, I found Dad in his office. I'll go, I said simply. I'll go to Ashfield. He nodded, showing neither triumph nor regret. Good. I'll make the arrangements. You'll leave in August. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and preparation. Dad hired a lawyer to draw up an actual agreement stipulating the terms of our arrangement, including the financial support he would provide, and the understanding that I would not return home. Seeing it in black and white in formal legal language made the abandonment feel even more complete. The night before I was set to leave for Ashfield, I snuck into Jack's room after he was asleep. I tucked a small sketchbook under his pillow, filled with drawings I had made for him, along with a note, promising that I would find a way to stay in touch somehow, no matter what Dad said. I love you, buddy, I whispered, kissing his forehead. Don't forget that, okay? The next morning, Dad loaded my suitcases into the car in silence. The drive to Massachusetts took just over 2 hours, but it felt like crossing an ocean every mile, taking me further from the only home I had ever known, however broken it had become. As we pulled up to Ashfield's impressive brick buildings and manicured grounds, Dad finally spoke. This is a fresh start, Eleanor. Make the most of it. In the administration building, he efficiently signed all the necessary papers while I sat numbly beside him. When it was time for him to leave, he extended his hand formally as if we were concluding a business meeting. Goodbye, Eleanor. I trust you'll uphold your end of our agreement. I didn't take his hand. Just so we're clear, I said, finding my voice at last. You're not sending me away. You're setting me free. Something flickered across his face too quickly to interpret. And then he turned and walked out of my life without looking back. I stood there, a 13-year-old girl with her life packed into 3 suitcases, watching through the window as my father drove away. I allowed myself one moment of complete despair, one moment to acknowledge the finality of what had just happened. Then I picked up my suitcases and turned toward my new life, not knowing if the pain in my chest would ever truly go away. The imposing red brick buildings of Ashfield Academy loomed over me as I followed Mrs. Winters, the house mother, to what would be my home for the next 5 years. The campus resembled a small college more than a high school, with its Gothic architecture and sprawling green quadrangles where students lounged in small groups enjoying the last days of summer before classes began. "You're in Whitman House Room 214, Mrs. Winters explained, leading me up a grand staircase in a building that smelled of polish and old books. You'll be sharing with Teresa Banks. She's a returning sophomore, so she can help you learn the ropes." Room 214 was larger than my bedroom at home, with two neatly made twin beds, matching desks, and large windows overlooking an athletic field. On one side, the desk and shelves were already cluttered with books, photographs, and various trinkets, clearly marking Teresa's territory. "Dinner is at 6 in the main dining hall," Mrs. Winters said, setting down the suitcase she had helped me carry. "Orientation for new students begins tomorrow at 9. Do you have any questions, Eleanor?" I shook my head, overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all. "Very well. Your roommate should be back from her tennis practice soon. Try to settle in." Left alone, I sat on the bare mattress of what would be my bed and finally allowed the tears to come. I cried for my little brother, for my lost mother, for the father who had essentially disowned me, and for myself alone in this unfamiliar place where I knew no one. I was still unpacking when the door burst open and a girl with a honey blonde ponytail and flushed cheeks bounded in, dressed in a tennis skirt and Ashfield polo shirt. "Oh, you must be Eleanor," she exclaimed, dropping her racket on her bed. "I'm Tessa. Sorry I'm all sweaty from practice. Did you just get here? How was your trip? Where are you from again?" The rapid-fire questions momentarily stunned me, but there was something infectious about Tessa's energy that made it impossible to retreat back into my shell of misery. "Connecticut," I answered simply. "And yes, I just got here." Tessa flopped onto her bed, regarding me with curious blue eyes. "First time at boarding school." I nodded. "Well, you'll get used to it. I cried every night my first week last year, but now I love it. The classes are tough but really good, and most of the teachers are cool, except Mr. Harrington, he's a total dragon, but you learn to avoid getting on his bad side." Her casual friendliness was like a life raft in the sea of uncertainty I was drowning in. I managed a small smile, which Tessa immediately counted as a victory. "There we go, a smile. We're going to be friends, Eleanor Thompson. I can tell already." She bounced up. "Let me show you around before dinner. You'll want to know where the bathrooms are at least, and I can point out all the shortcuts around campus." That first tour with Tessa began a friendship that would become my anchor at Ashfield and beyond. She was everything I wasn't: outgoing, naturally confident, from a wealthy New York family that had attended Ashfield for generations. But unlike many of the other privileged students I would encounter, Tessa never made me feel less than. She simply folded me into her life as if I had always belonged there. The first weeks at Ashfield were still brutally difficult. I felt out of place among students who casually discussed their summer homes in the Hamptons or ski trips to Aspen. Many came from old money and had been groomed since birth to move through elite spaces like Ashfield. My middle-class Connecticut upbringing, though comfortable, had not prepared me for the casual wealth that surrounded me now. Classes were challenging in a way that my public school education hadn't prepared me for. I found myself struggling to keep up, particularly in Latin and advanced mathematics subjects that many of my classmates had been studying since elementary school. But there was one place where I immediately felt at home: the art studio. Ashfield's art program was indeed exceptional, housed in a light-filled building with state-of-the-art facilities. The art teacher, Ms. Hamilton, was a working artist herself who had exhibited in galleries in New York and Boston. During my first art class, Ms. Hamilton circulated the room as we worked on still life drawings, offering gentle critiques and suggestions. When she reached my easel, she stopped longer than she had for other students. "You have a natural understanding of perspective," she commented, studying my drawing of a complex arrangement of geometric shapes. "And your use of negative space is quite sophisticated. Have you had formal training before, Eleanor?" "No," I admitted. "Just school classes and books from the library." "Remarkable," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "I think you might benefit from some additional challenges. Would you be interested in staying after class sometimes to work on more advanced projects?" That offer became another lifeline. The art studio became my sanctuary, a place where I could process the complicated emotions that churned inside me and translate them into something tangible. Ms. Hamilton never pried into my personal life, but she seemed to understand intuitively that art was more than an academic subject for me. It was a necessity. The first major hurdle came during Parents' Weekend in October. The campus transformed as families arrived to visit their children, bringing care packages and taking them out to dinner in town. Tessa's parents invited me to join them, but I declined, not wanting to intrude on their family time. Instead, I spent the weekend in the nearly empty art studio, working on a series of architectural sketches that Ms. Hamilton had encouraged me to develop. When she found me there on Sunday afternoon, still working while most students were saying goodbye to their parents, she didn't comment on my situation directly. "You know, Eleanor," she said instead, examining my work, "with your spatial awareness and technical precision, you might consider architecture as a career path. It combines artistic expression with practical application in a way that I think would suit your talents." It was the first time anyone had suggested a concrete direction for my future that aligned with my interests rather than dismissing them. The seed Ms. Hamilton planted that day would eventually grow into my life's work. The holidays proved even more challenging than Parents' Weekend. While most students went home for Thanksgiving and the longer winter break, Ashfield maintained a small residential program for international students and the handful of domestic students who for various reasons had nowhere else to go. The campus felt like a ghost town during those periods. The administration organised activities and special meals to compensate, but nothing could disguise the fact that we were the left-behind ones, the students whose families didn't want or couldn't have them home. During the first winter break, I tried calling the house to speak to Jack, desperate to hear my brother's voice after months of separation. The number had been changed to unlisted, another door closed by my father. I wrote letters to Jack instead, sending them to Aunt Maggie, with instructions to pass them along when she visited. I never knew if they reached him, as Aunt Maggie's promised visits to check on Jack seemed to become less frequent according to her increasingly brief and apologetic phone calls to me. As months turned into years, I poured all my energy into academics and art, determined to excel, if only to prove to myself that I had value. The pain of my father's rejection never fully disappeared, but it transformed from an acute agony into a dull, persistent ache that I learnt to function around. By my junior year at Ashfield, I had risen to the top of my class academically. My artwork had won several regional competitions, and Ms. Hamilton was helping me prepare a portfolio for college applications. I had even made a small circle of friends beyond Tessa, though I kept everyone except her at a careful distance, afraid to become too attached to people who might leave. It was during spring break of my junior year that Aunt Maggie made her only visit to campus. We met at a cafe in the small town adjacent to Ashfield, where she delivered news of home with obvious discomfort. "Jack's been sent to Westfield Military Academy," she told me, stirring her coffee obsessively. "Your father decided he needed more discipline. He's 10 now, can you believe it?" I couldn't believe it. In my mind, Jack was still the little 6-year-old I had left behind. The thought of him in a military school without me there to protect him was almost unbearable. "Is he okay?" I asked, my voice tight with concern. Aunt Maggie avoided my eyes. "He's adjusting. It's a good school, very structured. Your father can afford the best at least." Just as he had for me, I thought bitterly, paying for absence rather than presence. "Have you told him about me? Does he remember me?" The questions tumbled out desperately. "Eleanor," Aunt Maggie said gently, finally meeting my gaze, "I think it might be best if you focus on your own future now. You're doing so well here. College applications will be starting soon. Yes, you have a real chance at something special." Her evasion was answer enough. Jack was lost to me, at least for now. The revelation hardened something inside me, a determination that would drive me forward. If my father could so easily discard his children and replace parenting with paid institutions, then I would become so successful, so undeniably accomplished, that his rejection would be revealed as the greatest mistake of his life. That determination carried me through my final 2 years at Ashfield. I graduated as valedictorian with a full scholarship to Cornell University's prestigious architecture program, the path Ms. Hamilton had first suggested years earlier. On graduation day, I scanned the audience during the ceremony, a tiny part of me still hoping against hope that my father might appear, that he might witness this moment of triumph. He didn't come. But as I accepted my diploma to enthusiastic applause, I realized I no longer needed him to. I had built a foundation for myself, brick by painful brick, that would support whatever life I chose to construct upon it. Cornell University's campus in Ithaca, New York, became my home for the next 5 years, as I pursued a bachelor's and then master's in architecture. The scholarship covered my tuition, and I worked part-time jobs to pay for living expenses, determined to rely on my father's money as little as possible, though he continued to deposit funds into my account, as promised in our agreement. College brought new freedoms and challenges. I thrived academically, my Ashfield education having prepared me well for the rigours of university studies. The architecture program was intensely competitive, but I found that the drive that had developed in me after my father's rejection served me well in this environment too. Socially, I remained cautious. Tessa also attended Cornell studying business, and we remained roommates, her natural sociability gradually drawing me out of my shell. Through her, I made friends with a diverse group of students, many studying arts or design like me. We formed a tight-knit creative community, spending late nights in the studio, helping each other with projects, and unwinding afterward at local cafes and bars. "You know what I love about you, Ellie," Tessa said one night as we walked home from a gallery opening featuring student work, including 2 of my architectural models. "You're the most determined person I've ever met. When you decide to do something, it's like watching someone build a path one stone at a time, no matter what's in the way." Her observation startled me. I had never thought of myself as particularly determined, just desperate not to fail. "I don't have much choice," I replied. "No one's going to hand me anything." Tessa linked her arm through mine. "That's not true. You have people who would give you anything you needed if you'd just ask. Me for one. You don't have to do everything alone, you know." Her words struck a chord that resonated uncomfortably. I had grown so accustomed to self-reliance that the idea of leaning on others felt almost like a betrayal of the strength I'd built. But college gradually taught me that independence and connection weren't mutually exclusive. I could be strong on my own and still allow others into my life. This revelation changed me slowly but fundamentally, softening some of the harder edges that had developed since my father's rejection. During the summer between my junior and senior years, I secured an internship at Werner and Associates, a renowned architectural firm in Boston. The experience was transformative, giving me my first taste of working on real-world projects, rather than theoretical academic designs. Mr. Werner himself took an interest in my work, mentoring me throughout the summer and offering me a position after graduation. "You have a rare combination of technical precision and artistic vision," he told me during my exit interview. "We'd be very interested in having you join our team once you've completed your degree." That offer became my goal, a concrete next step that would launch my professional career. I returned to Cornell for my senior year with renewed focus, developing a thesis project that combined sustainable design principles with the artistic elements I had always been drawn to. After graduating summa cum laude from Cornell, I took a week to visit Tessa's family in New York before starting my job at Werner and Associates. It was during this visit, surrounded by the warm embrace of Tessa's loving parents and siblings, that I made an impulsive decision. "I'm going to try to see my father," I announced over breakfast one morning, "before I start work in Boston." Tessa looked up from her toast in surprise. "Are you sure it's been, 9 years? 8, I corrected. "And yes, I'm sure. I need to see him now that I've accomplished what I set out to do. I want him to see who I've become." The truth was more complicated than I could express. Part of me wanted validation, part wanted reconciliation, and another darker part wanted to show him exactly what he had thrown away. I wasn't sure which motivation was strongest, but the pull to confront my past before beginning my future was undeniable. 2 days later, I stood on the familiar porch of my childhood home in Lakeside, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The house looked smaller than I remembered, and somewhat neglected, the paint peeling slightly around the windows, and the garden beds overgrown with weeds. I rang the doorbell, half expecting no one to answer, but after a moment the door swung open to reveal my father, looking older and greyer than I had anticipated. He stared at me for a long moment, recognition dawning slowly in his eyes. "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice flat. "Hello, Dad," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. He didn't invite me in. Instead, he stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him as if to prevent me from seeing inside, or perhaps to prevent whoever was inside from seeing me. "This wasn't part of our agreement," he said stiffly. 8 years of built-up emotion threatened to overflow. "I graduated from Cornell last month, with honors. I'm starting a job at Werner and Associates in Boston next week. I thought maybe you'd want to know." Something flickered across his face too quick to interpret. "Congratulations." He said the word empty of any real sentiment. "I'm glad the investment paid off." Investment, not daughter, not even student. Investment. "Is Jack here?" I asked, changing tactics. "He'd be 14 now. I'd like to see him." Jack is at summer camp, my father replied. And I think it would be best if you continued to honor our arrangement, Eleanor. You've built your life. We've built ours. There's no need to complicate things now. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Whatever small hope I had harbored for reconciliation died in that moment, replaced by a cold clarity. My father had not changed. The door he had closed when I was 13 remained firmly shut, and no achievement of mine would ever be enough to open it. I understand, I said, and was proud that my voice didn't break. Goodbye, Dad. I turned and walked away, not looking back, even when I heard the door close with a decisive click. The visit had been a mistake, but a necessary one. Now I knew with absolute certainty that I owed my father nothing, not even the hope of forgiveness. Boston became my new beginning. I threw myself into my work at Werner & Associates, quickly establishing myself as one of the firm's most promising young architects. The long hours and demanding projects left little time for dwelling on the past, which suited me perfectly. Through a colleague, I met David Matthews, a structural engineer who consulted on several of our projects. Our professional relationship gradually evolved into friendship and then cautiously on my part into romance. David's patient, steady presence slowly earned my trust, though I kept the full story of my family history to myself for a long time. When I finally did share it with him on our 1-year anniversary, his reaction was a careful balance of empathy and restraint. I can't imagine doing that to a child, he said quietly after I had finished recounting my father's ultimatum. But Eleanor, you should know that his failure to love you properly wasn't a reflection of your worth. It was a reflection of his limitations. Those words began a slow healing process that continued as our relationship deepened. With David, I began to understand what healthy love looked like, the kind that supported without demanding, that cherished without possessing. 5 years into my career, I received the Association of American Architects Young Innovator Award for a public library design that had garnered national attention. The recognition accelerated my professional trajectory, leading to larger projects and eventually a junior partnership at the firm now renamed Werner Schumann & Associates. It was around this time at age 30 that I finally managed to reconnect with Jack. Through some determined internet searching, I discovered he had graduated from Westfield Military Academy and gone on to attend Virginia Tech. A university email address led to a tentative exchange of messages, which evolved into phone calls and eventually a meeting at a neutral location, a cafe in New York, halfway between Boston and Washington, D.C., where he was working in finance. The young man who greeted me bore little resemblance to the little boy I had left behind, but when he smiled, I caught a glimpse of the Jack I remembered. We spent hours talking, filling in the vast gaps in our knowledge of each other's lives. Dad told me you chose to leave, Jack said, stirring his coffee in a gesture that painfully reminded me of our mother. He said you wanted to focus on your art and that you preferred boarding school to family life. The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, but it still stung. That's not what happened, Jack. I told him the truth, watching his expression shift from confusion to shock to anger as he understood the full extent of our father's manipulation. He kept us apart deliberately, Jack said when I had finished. All those letters you tried to send, I never got any of them. I thought you'd just forgotten about me. Never, I assured him, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. Not for one single day. Jack shared his own stories of growing up with our father, who had apparently swung between disinterested neglect and controlling pressure after sending me away. Military school had been his solution when Jack began acting out in his early teens. He's different now, though. Jack added a note of hesitation in his voice. Mellowed, I guess. Retired early after some health problems. He even came to my wedding last year. You're married? I asked, realizing how much I had missed. Jack nodded, a smile warming his face. To Sarah. We met in college. You'd like her, Eleanor. She's an art teacher, actually. The conversation shifted to happier topics, Jack's life with Sarah, their hopes to start a family, soon my career and relationship with David. By the time we parted, we had promised to stay in touch regularly, determined not to lose each other again. True to that promise, Jack and I began rebuilding our sibling relationship. We called weekly, visited when possible, and gradually reclaimed something of what had been stolen from us. When Jack and Sarah had their first child, a daughter they named Diana, after our mother, they asked me to be her godmother, a role I accepted with tears of joy. Life settled into a pattern that, while not perfect, was rich with meaning and connection. I had built a successful career, a loving relationship, and had reclaimed at least one important family bond. The wound of my father's rejection had scarred over, still visible, but no longer actively painful. Or so I thought until the call came that would force me to confront the past I thought I had finally put behind me. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early October when my phone rang during a client meeting. I excused myself briefly to check the screen, prepared to ignore it, but the area code caught my attention. Connecticut. No one from my hometown ever called me. I need to take this, I told my colleagues. I'll just be a moment. I stepped into the hallway, heart pounding inexplicably as I answered. This is Eleanor Thompson. Ms. Thompson, my name is Joanne Mendez. I'm a social worker at Lakeside General Hospital. The woman's voice was professionally compassionate. I'm calling regarding your father, Samuel Thompson. My grip tightened on the phone. What about him? He's been admitted with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis is not good. A few months at most. He's asked us to contact you. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same disease that had taken my mother was now claiming my father. I see, I said, struggling to process the information, and he specifically asked for me. You're certain? Yes, he's been quite insistent about reaching you. There was a pause. He seems very anxious to speak with you before. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Before he dies. My father, who had banished me from his life at 13, now wanted me back in it at the end. Ms. Thompson, are you still there? Yes, sorry, this is unexpected. I understand, she said gently. Your father mentioned that you haven't been in contact for some time, but regardless of past history, many patients find it important to resolve unfinished business when facing end-of-life situations. Would you be willing to at least speak with him on the phone? The request seemed simple enough, yet it unleashed a hurricane of conflicting emotions. Anger, hurt, confusion, and underneath it all a small, persistent spark of the childish hope that had never quite died. The hope that my father might finally explain himself, might finally see me, might finally express some form of regret or love before it was too late. I'll need to think about it, I said finally. Can I call you back tomorrow? Of course. She gave me her direct line. Please know that there's no pressure either way. This is entirely your decision. After hanging up, I stood in the hallway for several long minutes trying to compose myself before returning to my meeting. The professional part of my brain took over, allowing me to finish the client presentation on autopilot, while the emotional part churned beneath the surface. That evening, I told David about the call as we prepared dinner in our Cambridge apartment. His response was measured as always. What do you think you want to do? He asked, pausing and chopping vegetables to give me his full attention. I don't know, I admitted, leaning against the counter. Part of me wants to tell him to go to hell. After all this time to only reach out when he's dying, it feels manipulative. David nodded. That's a valid response. But another part... I hesitated. Another part wonders if I'll regret it if I don't at least hear what he has to say, if I don't take this last chance to understand why he did what he did. That's also valid, David said. You don't have to decide right now. Sleep on it, maybe talk to Dr. Brennan about it at your session tomorrow. Dr. Brennan had been my therapist for the past 3 years. Initially reluctant to try therapy, I had finally sought help when panic attacks began interfering with my work. The root cause, unsurprisingly, traced back to my childhood abandonment and the complex trauma it had created. The next day, Dr. Brennan listened carefully as I explained the situation. It sounds like you're torn between protecting yourself from further hurt and pursuing potential closure, she observed. Both are understandable impulses. What would you do? I asked a question I rarely posed to her. That's not for me to say, she replied predictably. But I will say this, whatever you decide, make the choice that serves your healing, not his. This isn't about giving your father what he wants or punishing him. It's about what you need at this point in your journey. That evening, I called Jack to discuss the situation. His reaction surprised me. I think you should see him, he said after a thoughtful pause. Not for his sake, but for yours. Why do you say that? I asked, genuinely curious. Because he's been different these past few years, Eleanor. Ever since his heart attack 3 years ago, there's been a change. He's talked about you, asked about your career. I think he regrets what he did. The revelation that my father had been asking about me stung in an unexpected way. If he had been interested, why wait until now to reach out? Has he ever explicitly said he regrets sending me away? I pressed. Not in those exact words, Jack admitted. But there's been a shift. Look, I'm not defending what he did. It was unforgivable. I'm just saying that if you If you never hear him out, you might always wonder. After hanging up with Jack, I sat on our small balcony, looking out at the Boston skyline as twilight descended. The city lights began to twinkle on a constellation of human lives, interconnecting in ways both seen and unseen. Somewhere in those lights were other families with their own complicated histories, their own wounds and reconciliations. The decision crystallized slowly as night fell, not from any dramatic epiphany, but from a quiet certainty that rose from the deepest part of me. I would go see my father, not for his absolution or even necessarily for closure, but to face this final chapter with open eyes. Whatever came of it, I would no longer be the abandoned 13-year-old girl or even the rejected college graduate. I would be Eleanor Thompson, architect, partner, sister, friend, a woman who had built a life of meaning, despite or perhaps because of the hardships she had faced. The next morning, I called Joanne Mendez and informed her of my decision. Then I booked a flight to Connecticut for the following weekend. David drove me to the airport, his steady presence a balm to my frayed nerves. "Remember," he said as he hugged me goodbye at the security checkpoint, "whatever happens, you're coming home to people who love you exactly as you are." With those words fortifying me, I boarded the plane that would carry me back to the place I had once called home, unsure of what awaited me, but determined to face it on my own terms. The antiseptic smell of Lakeside General Hospital brought back unwanted memories of my mother's final days. I followed the signs to the oncology ward, where Joanne Mendez had agreed to meet me before I saw my father. She was waiting at the nurse's station, a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a professional demeanour. After introducing herself properly, she guided me to a small consultation room. "I wanted to speak with you briefly before you see your father," she explained, gesturing for me to sit, "to give you a sense of his condition and what to expect." "How bad is it?" I asked, bracing myself. "The cancer is aggressive and has metastasized to his liver and lungs. He's relatively comfortable with pain management, but he tires easily and has good and bad days. Today has been a better day, which is why we thought it would be good for your visit." I nodded, trying to prepare myself mentally. "He knows you're coming," she continued. "He's been quite anxious about it, actually. I should warn you that he's lost a significant amount of weight, so his appearance might be shocking if you haven't seen someone with advanced cancer before." "My mother died of pancreatic cancer when I was 12, I said quietly. "I remember what it looks like." Joanne's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. That must make this even more difficult." "Has he said why he wanted to see me?" I asked, changing the subject. "He's not very forthcoming about personal matters, but he has mentioned regrets and unfinished business. Beyond that, I think you'll need to hear from him directly." She stood. "Are you ready?" As ready as I'll ever be, I thought, but said simply, "Yes." Room 412 was at the end of a long corridor. Joanne knocked gently before opening the door. "Mr. Thompson, your daughter is here to see you." She stepped aside to let me enter, then quietly closed the door behind me, leaving us alone. The man in the hospital bed was a diminished version of my father. His once robust frame had withered, his face gaunt, with hollowed cheeks, his skin bearing the yellowish tinge of liver involvement. But his eyes, when they found mine, were still the same deep blue I remembered now, magnified by the prominence of his skull. "Eleanor," he said, his voice raspy, but stronger than I had expected. "You came." I remained near the door, not quite ready to approach. "Yes." An awkward silence stretched between us. 21 years of absence, compressed into a few feet of hospital room space. "You look like your mother," he said finally. The comparison to my mother, once a source of pain when I was younger, now felt like a compliment. "Thank you." He gestured weakly to the chair beside his bed. "Will you sit just for a few minutes?" After a moment's hesitation, I crossed the room and took the seat, careful to maintain some distance from the bed. Up close, the ravages of the disease were even more apparent. My father had always been a commanding presence, his posture perfect, his movements deliberate and controlled. Seeing him reduced to this frail shell was disorienting, despite my mental preparation. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Neither was I replied honestly. He nodded slightly, as if my candour was expected and even welcomed. "How much did they tell you about my condition?" "Enough. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, metastasized. Terminal, why," he added flatly. 3 months, maybe 4, if the new treatment shows any effect, which is unlikely." The clinical way he discussed his prognosis was so typically him that it almost made me smile despite everything. My father had always faced facts head-on, at least when they pertained to business or practical matters. Emotions were the territory he avoided. "I'm sorry," I said, because it seemed like the appropriate response, even if my feelings were far more complicated than simple sympathy. He waved away my words. "I didn't ask you here for pity, Eleanor." "Then why did you ask me here?" He took a laboured breath, his chest rising and falling sharply beneath the thin hospital gown. "Because I owe you an explanation. And an apology, though, I don't expect you to accept it." The directness of his statement caught me off guard. I had anticipated evasion, perhaps even a rewriting of history, to cast himself in a better light. Not this blunt acknowledgement. "I'm listening," I said, my voice carefully neutral. My father looked past me to the window where late afternoon sunlight filtered through partially closed blinds, casting striped shadows across the room. "After your mother died, I was lost. More than lost, I was broken in ways I didn't understand and couldn't control. The drinking made it worse, but it also numbed the pain temporarily." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "You reminded me so much of her, Eleanor. Every time I looked at you, I saw Diane, and it was like losing her all over again day after day. So you sent me away because I looked like Mom." The hurt and anger I had suppressed started to surface. "That's your explanation." He shook his head slowly. "No, that's not it, though. It was part of it. I sent you away because I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone cruel and destructive. The way I treated you after your mother died." He closed his eyes briefly. "I saw what I was doing to you, how I was crushing your spirit bit by bit. In my twisted thinking at the time, sending you to Ashfield seemed like the only way to save you from me. You could have gotten help," I countered. "Therapy, rehab for the drinking, anything other than abandoning your child." "Yes," he agreed simply. "I could have, I should have, but I didn't have the tools or the self-awareness then. My own father." He trailed off, and for the first time I noticed a vulnerability in his expression I had never seen before. "Your own father what?" I prompted. "Was a tyrant," he finished. "Physically abusive, emotionally absent. I swore I'd never be like him, but when your mother died, I found myself slipping into those same patterns. The anger, the criticism, the distance. I panicked, Eleanor. I convinced myself that giving you an elite education far away from me was the kindest thing I could do. The revelation of my grandfather's abuse, a man who had died before I was born and was rarely mentioned, shifted something in my understanding of my father. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it provided context I had never had before. You still could have allowed visits, phone calls, some connection, I said, unwilling to let him off too easily. You didn't have to make it an all-or-nothing proposition. He nodded, accepting the criticism. You're right, the complete severance was extreme. Inexcusable, really. Part of me knew that even then, but I had convinced myself it was cleaner this way, less confusing for you and Jack. A bitter smile twisted his lips. I was very good at rationalizing my worst decisions. What about Jack? I asked. Why send him to military school? Because I was failing him too, just in different ways. By then I was working constantly, rarely home. When I was there, I was either distant or overbearing. He started acting out, getting in trouble at school. The same pattern was repeating itself. So your solution to being a bad father was to not be a father at all. I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. Yes, he admitted, meeting my gaze directly. That's exactly what I did, and I was wrong, profoundly, unforgivably wrong. I realized it too late to fix things with you. By the time I understood the magnitude of my mistake, you were in college building your own life. I told myself it would be selfish to disrupt that, just to ease my own conscience. A wave of exhaustion seemed to wash over him, and he sank deeper into his pillows. I could see that the conversation was draining what little energy he had. Why now? I asked the most crucial question of all. Why reach out now after all this time? Because I'm dying, but he said simply. And I couldn't bear to go to my grave without at least trying to tell you how sorry I am, how proud I am of the woman you've become despite my failures. I followed your career, Eleanor. The library in Portland, that mixed-use development in Chicago. Extraordinary work. The revelation that he had been tracking my professional achievements all along stunned me into silence. All these years, I had believed I was completely erased from his consciousness, yet he had been watching from afar, seeing the architect I had become, without ever reaching out. I don't expect forgiveness, he continued, his voice growing weaker. I don't deserve it, but I needed you to know that what I did was never because you weren't enough or because I didn't love you. It was because I was broken and couldn't find a way to heal myself without hurting you in the process. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and I found myself caught in a tumult of emotions. The lingering anger of the abandoned child, the cautious hope of the adult seeking resolution, the confusion of seeing this new version of my father humbled by illness and regret. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "This is a lot to process." "You don't need to say anything now," he replied. "Just knowing that you were willing to come to listen means more than I can express." His eyelids drooped, fatigue clearly overtaking him. Would you consider coming back again before I die?" The unspoken end of his sentence hung in the air between us. "I'll think about it," I said, rising from the chair. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a refusal either. He nodded, accepting the ambiguity of my response. As I turned to leave, he spoke once more, his voice barely audible. "You were always the strongest of us all, Eleanor, even as a child. I'm sorry I couldn't be the father you deserved." In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, overwhelmed by the conversation and its implications. The father I had hated and feared for so long had been replaced by this diminished, regretful man who acknowledged his failures without excuses. It didn't erase the past, but it complicated my carefully constructed narrative of abandonment and rejection. As I left the hospital, I felt neither the catharsis I had secretly hoped for, nor the vindicated anger I had half expected. Instead, I felt unsettled, as if the ground beneath a structure I had carefully designed was shifting, requiring new calculations and adjustments to maintain stability. Back in my hotel room, I called David, trying to sort through my tangled thoughts by articulating them to someone who knew me well enough to understand their complexity. He acknowledged everything, I told him, pacing the small room. No excuses, no minimizing. Just took responsibility for all of it. "That's something," David observed. "More than many people in his position would do." He said he's been following my career, David. He knew about my projects, specific buildings I've designed. All this time I thought he had completely erased me from his life, but apparently he's been keeping track. "How does that make you feel?" The simple question stopped my pacing. I don't know, confused, angry that he could have reached out at any point but didn't until now, but also, I don't know, maybe relieved that I wasn't completely forgotten. It's complicated. "Of course it is," David said gently. "There's no rule book for navigating this kind of situation, Eleanor. You get to feel whatever you feel, even if those feelings contradict each other." After hanging up, I sat by the window of my hotel room, looking out at the town where I had grown up, now changed in many ways, but still fundamentally recognizable. Like my father, like myself, the core remained while the surface transformed with time. The question of whether to return to the hospital to continue this belated conversation with my dying father weighed heavily. There were no easy answers, no clearly correct path, only choices each with their own consequences, just like the choices my father had made all those years ago that had altered the course of our lives. I would need to decide how this story ended, with a door firmly closed, or with a crack of light allowed to shine through before it was too late. The weekend stretched before me, 2 more days in Connecticut before my scheduled return to Boston. I had left my decision about visiting my father again, deliberately open-ended, needing time to process our first encounter. After a restless night in the hotel, I drove aimlessly around Lakeside, reacquainting myself with the town of my childhood. Much had changed in 2 decades, small businesses replaced by chain stores, new housing developments sprawling where woods once stood. But the essential character remained the town centre, with its white clapboard church, the small park where Mum used to take me, to feed ducks, the public library, where I had first discovered books about architecture. I parked near the library and went inside, curious if the building that had once been my sanctuary had changed as much as I had. The layout was different, modernized with computer stations and a coffee cart, but the essential feeling of welcome remained. In the art section, I found some of the same oversized books that had captivated me as a child, now well worn from years of use. While browsing, I came across a book showcasing contemporary American architecture that included one of my designs. Seeing my work in print in my hometown library created an odd full-circle moment that left me momentarily disoriented. "Can I help you find something specific?" I turned to find an older librarian smiling at me. For a moment, I thought she might recognize me, but her expression remained friendly and impersonal. "No, thank you. Just browsing." As I left the library, my phone rang. It was Jack. "Are you still in Lakeside?" he asked without preamble. "Yes, until tomorrow afternoon. I'm driving up. Just dropped Sarah and Diana at her parents' for the weekend, and I'm about an hour away. Could we meet somewhere? The prospect of seeing my brother lifted my spirits. Absolutely. There's a cafe on Main Street called the Copper Kettle. Does that still exist? It does, Jack confirmed. Meet you there at noon. The Copper Kettle had been renovated since my childhood, its former homey clutter replaced by a more streamlined, Instagram-friendly aesthetic. But the cinnamon rolls were still the size of dinner plates, a local tradition that had thankfully survived the updating. Jack arrived precisely at noon, looking like the successful young financial analyst he was in his casual weekend clothes. We hugged the physical contact still novel after so many years apart, before settling at a corner table with our coffee and shared cinnamon roll. So you saw him, Jack said, getting straight to the point. How was it? I recounted the hospital visit in detail, including our father's explanations and apologies. Jack listened intently, his expression thoughtful. That tracks with some things he's said to me over the past few years. He said when I had finished, not in so many words and never so directly, but there have been hints of regret, especially after his heart attack. Do you think he's genuine? I asked, valuing my brother's perspective as someone who had maintained some connection, however tenuous, with our father. Jack considered the question carefully. I do. The man I've known these past few years is different from the father we grew up with. More reflective, less rigid. The cancer diagnosis seems to have accelerated that change, stripped away some of his defences. He paused, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. I'm not saying that excuses anything, Eleanor. What he did to you, to both of us, really was inexcusable, but I do believe he's sincere in his regret. He asked if I'd come back again. Will you? The question hung between us, as complicated for Jack as it was for me. Despite having maintained minimal contact with our father, Jack too had been profoundly affected by his emotional abandonment, his own wounds running deep beneath his successful exterior. I'm still deciding, I admitted. Part of me wants to just walk away to give him a taste of his own medicine, but another part wants closure, Jack finished for me. Or at least a more complete understanding. Something like that, I agreed. What would you do if you were me? Jack's expression grew serious. I can't answer that, Ellie. Your experience with him was different from mine, more extreme. The choice has to be yours. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small photo album. But I brought something that might help you decide. Sarah found this when we were clearing out some old boxes. It's from Dad's study. He pushed the album across the table. Opening it, I found a collection of newspaper clippings, printed articles and photographs, all related to my career. Awards I had won, buildings I had designed, profiles in architectural magazines, all carefully preserved and organised chronologically. He kept all this. My voice faltered as I turned the pages, seeing my professional life documented with what could only be described as pride. Jack nodded. For years, apparently. Sarah found it when she was helping him organise his papers after the heart attack. The discovery of this tangible evidence of my father's ongoing interest in my life, despite our estrangement, complicated my feelings further. It didn't erase the pain of his rejection, but it suggested a connection he had maintained privately, perhaps unable to bridge the gap he himself had created. After Jack left to drive back to New York, I returned to my hotel and spent the evening with the photo album, examining each clipping, each carefully preserved record of my achievements. The collection raised as many questions as it answered. If he had cared enough to track my career so meticulously, why had he rebuffed my attempt to reconnect after college? Why had he waited until he was dying to reach out? By morning, I had made my decision. I would return to the hospital one more time, not with any expectation of perfect resolution, but with a willingness to continue the conversation that had begun. Whatever closure was possible in this complicated situation would have to be found in these final exchanges, imperfect as they might be. I called ahead this time, asking the nurses about the best time to visit. They suggested early afternoon, when my father would have had his lunch and pain medication, typically leaving him alert but comfortable for a few hours. This time I came prepared, bringing with me a small portfolio of photographs, pictures of my childhood that Aunt Maggie had given me years ago, images of projects I had designed, and a recent photo of Jack with Sarah and baby Diana that he had agreed I could share. My father was sitting up in bed when I arrived, looking marginally better than during my previous visit. Someone had helped him shave, and he wore a proper button-up pajama top rather than a hospital gown, small dignities in the face of his decline. I wasn't sure you'd come back, he said, a cautious hope in his voice. Neither was I replied honestly, taking the same chair as before. I opened the portfolio and removed the first photograph, a faded image of myself at about 5 years old, sitting at the small table in his home office, drawing intently while he worked at his desk in the background. "Do you remember this?" I asked, placing it on his bed tray. He picked it up, his hands trembling slightly. "Your mother took this. You used to sit so quietly concentrating on your drawings. I used to think you had more focus than most of my employees." The memory shared now between us created a tentative bridge across the years of silence. "You said yesterday that you followed my career," I continued. "Jack showed me the album you kept." A flash of embarrassment crossed his face. "Ah, he found that. Why did you keep track of my work if you wanted nothing to do with me personally?" The directness of my question seemed to catch him off guard, but after a moment he answered with equal directness. "Because I was a coward, Eleanor. Because it was easier to admire your accomplishments from a safe distance than to face the damage I had done and try to repair it. Every time I read about a new project of yours or saw your name mentioned in an article, I told myself I was proud of you, that the sacrifice had been worth it, because look how successful you'd become." He sighed, the sound rattling slightly in his chest. It was another rationalization, of course, a way to convince myself that my absence from your life was somehow a gift, rather than what it really was, a failure of courage and character. His admission was startling in its self-awareness, far from the defensive justification I might have expected. When I came to the house after college, I said, addressing another lingering question, "Why did you turn me away?" Pain flickered across his face, whether physical or emotional I couldn't tell. "Because I was ashamed, Eleanor. You had become this accomplished, poised young woman despite everything, and I couldn't face the reality of what I had thrown away. It was easier to maintain the wall between us than to try to explain the inexplicable. And now I'm dying for," he said simply. "It has a way of clarifying priorities, stripping away pretenses. I don't have the luxury of pride or shame anymore. All I have left is the truth, however inadequate it might be." I showed him more photographs, including the recent one of Jack's family. "Diana," he said softly, touching the image of his granddaughter. "She has Diane's eyes, don't you think?" And her smile, I agreed, a bittersweet ache accompanying the observation. We talked for nearly 2 hours longer than I had anticipated. He asked about my current projects, my life in Boston, my relationship with David. I answered honestly, but with careful boundaries, willing to share, but not ready to fully invite him into the life I had built without him. In turn, he spoke of his retirement, his growing relationship with Jack in recent years, his regrets about the choices he had made. The conversation wasn't easy, punctuated by difficult moments and painful memories, but it had an authenticity that had always been lacking in our relationship. As our time together drew to a close, I could see fatigue overtaking him again. Before leaving, I asked the question that had been lingering since his first call to the hospital. "What do you want from me now, Dad? Beyond these conversations, what are you hoping for?" He considered the question carefully before answering. "I want whatever you're willing to give, Eleanor. I forfeited any right to expectations 21 years ago." He paused, his breathing labored. "If all I get is these few conversations before the end, that's already more than I deserve. But if you were able to forgive me someday, not for my sake, but for yours, I would count that as a blessing I never earned." Yeah. The humility in his answer moved me unexpectedly. This diminished man in the hospital bed facing his mortality, with a clarity he had lacked in life, was so far removed from the imposing, unyielding father of my childhood that reconciling the two versions seemed almost impossible. "I can't promise forgiveness," I said truthfully, "but I can promise to think about what you've said, to consider it honestly." He nodded, accepting the limitations of my response. "That's more than fair." As I gathered my things to leave, he reached for my hand, the first physical contact between us in over 2 decades. His fingers were cool and papery against mine, the grip weak but intentional. "Thank you for coming, Eleanor, for listening, for the remarkable woman you've become." I didn't pull my hand away immediately, allowing the contact to linger for a few seconds. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement of his humanity, of the complicated reality that people could change, even if that change came too late to undo the damage they had caused. Leaving the hospital this time, I felt a subtle shift within myself. The ground was still unsteady, the structure of my understanding still requiring adjustments, but there was a sense of progression, of movement towards some form of resolution, however imperfect it might be. In my hotel room that night, I called David again, needing to process the day's experiences. It sounds like these conversations are giving you something important, he observed after I had recounted the visit. Not the perfect Hollywood reconciliation, but something real. Yes, I agreed. It's messy and painful, and there are no easy answers, but it feels necessary somehow. I still don't know if I can forgive him fully, but I think I'm starting to understand him better, to see him as a flawed human rather than just the villain in my story. That's huge, Eleanor. And whatever you decide about forgiveness, that understanding is valuable in itself. After we hung up, I sat by the window again, watching the lights of Lakeside twinkle in the distance. Tomorrow I would return to Boston to my life and work carrying with me these complicated new perspectives on my father and our shared past. I didn't know if I would see him again before the end. That decision could wait for now. What mattered was that the door between us, closed for so many years, had been cracked open just enough to allow for the possibility of something neither of us had anticipated. Not the erasing of past wounds, but the beginning of a new, more honest understanding between two imperfect people, connected by blood and history, and now perhaps by something like grace. The weeks following my return to Boston took on a surreal quality, as if my life had split into parallel tracks. On one track, I continued my normal routines, working on architectural projects, sharing meals with David, meeting friends for coffee, all the ordinary rhythms that had defined my existence before the hospital call. On the second track, an ongoing conversation unfolded between my father and me, conducted through sporadic phone calls and occasional visits when my schedule allowed for the trip to Connecticut. Our communication was tentative at first, both of us wary of saying the wrong thing, of reopening wounds that had just begun to scab over. But gradually, a pattern emerged, a careful exchange of stories and memories that began to fill in the vast blank spaces in our knowledge of each other's lives. During one of my visits in late October, I brought my laptop to show him detailed images of my current project, an innovative community center in a historically underserved Boston neighborhood. As he studied the renderings, his face lit with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed his grasp of both business considerations and aesthetic choices. "You've incorporated elements of the neighborhood's cultural heritage into the design," he observed, pointing to specific architectural details. "That shows real sensitivity to context." "That was important to me," I explained. "The building needs to belong to the community, to feel like theirs, rather than something imposed from outside." "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. "She always believed that art should connect people, not separate them." The mention of Mom created a moment of shared remembrance, a rare point of connection in our fractured history. As October turned to November, my father's condition deteriorated noticeably. The new treatment his doctors had tried showed minimal effect, and his energy declined steadily. Our conversations became shorter, often interrupted by his need for rest or pain medication. Yet even in this weakened state, he seemed determined to use what time remained to bridge the gulf between us as